Welcome to Be an Upstander for Truth and Reconciliation. We're joining you today from the Canadian Journeys Gallery inside the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, Manitoba. My name is Roberta Everson, and I'll be facilitating your session today along with Graham and Ashley, who will be moderating the online session for those of you who are participating virtually. We'd like to thank Ms. Lavini Monias and her grade 9 students from Maples Collegiate who are joining you here on site today. Now, to help us get started in a good way, we would like to make some acknowledgements first. Located on Treaty 1 territory at the crossroads of the Red and Assiniboine Rivers, in a historic gathering place for the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, and Dakota Oyata and Dene Sulene, and in the birthplace of the homeland of the Red River Métis. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights continues to be a place dedicated to the evolution, celebration, and future of human rights. The water in the museum comes from Shoal Lake, and the First Nations in Treaty 3 have been caring for this water for thousands of years. We'd also like to acknowledge our Inuit relatives in the north and the ancestral lands that they call home. These acknowledgements are really just the starting point for honoring the land and water that gives us life, for embracing our responsibilities as the truth tellers and stewards of the collective stories of Canada, and for acknowledging the ongoing impacts of colonization and contributing to reconciliation. Now, our session today is about taking truth to action. That's the theme for this year's Truth and Reconciliation Week. But how do you take truth to action, and what does it mean? At the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, we think of people who take truth to action as upstanders. People who take a stand when they see an injustice in their community and do something for the people faced by this injustice. Now, our session today is about getting you started on being an upstander. We'll explore questions like, what is an upstander? How do you recognize injustice? And how do upstanders create change? To help you on your journey, we've created the Upstander Journal, which looks like this. If you've got a copy, keep it handy because we're going to need it through the session. If you don't have a copy, that's okay. You can use any pen and paper. We'll put the questions up as we go. Now, you've likely heard the word bystander, but at the museum, we like to use the word upstander. What do you think the difference is between an upstander and a bystander? We're going to go to table 1 on site first to give our virtual audience time to type in their questions.
A bystander is an individual who recognizes injustice but still deliberately chooses not to do anything about it. And an upstander is an individual who recognizes injustice and uses their personal strengths to spark change about it.
Okay, excellent. So bystander is somebody that tends to stand by and watch, and an upstander is somebody who takes action. Thank you. We've got some virtual.
Yeah, we have a response from the virtual chat saying that a bystander is the difference between watching versus doing. A bystander is someone who just stands by, and an upstander is someone who stands up.
Okay, excellent. So we're off to a good start already. Now, at the CMHR, we think of an upstander as a person who recognizes injustice, knows their personal strengths, and uses those personal strengths to make change in the way that they can in their community. An upstander is someone who takes a stand and defends human rights. Let's take a look at what each part of this definition means in a little closer detail. So first, what is an injustice? We're going to go to table 2 for this one on site.
Injustice means unfair, or when human rights are violated and undefined.
Yeah. Excellent. So that leads us to our next question. What are human rights?
Human rights are a standard that every human should have, like the right to have an education.
Yeah, the human rights are those basic standards that we need to live with dignity. They're universal, they're equal, and they're forever. And finally, what does it mean to take a stand?
To take a stand is to find our strength and to use it to fight against injustice for people who can't find their strength.
To stand up for what we believe in when we see something wrong. Excellent. And we've got some online responses.
Yeah, we have a response about human rights. It says human rights is something that humans can't do without, and injustice is where people don't follow fairness.
Okay, excellent. So it looks like we've all got a pretty good understanding of what the nuts and bolts of an upstander are. So our next question for this week is, what is reconciliation? Now, the reconciliation is what we're learning about this week. Reconciliation is something that will mean something to each one of us. But to help us have a shared definition for our session today going forward, we're going to look to the words of Adeline Newman Ting, who's an Indigenous youth activist, author, and upstander. And at last year's youth empowerment event with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, Adeline said, "We can't go back and fix the past. We can make amends by learning the truth and understanding what causes injustice. And we can change our behavior, and that is reconciliation." So with that thought, we know what an upstander is. Let's take a look at how people become upstanders. Well, people become upstanders in surprising ways. This is Shannon Kustashian. Shannon was from Attawapiskat First Nation in Northern Ontario. And in 2000, the only school in Shannon's community closed because 30 years earlier, a fuel leak contaminated the land near the school, and students and teachers began to get sick. So the federal government closed the school, and they put up portable trailers to act as a temporary school until it could build a new school for the 400 children of Attawapiskat. Now, these trailers were classrooms only. They had no library, there was no gym, there was no playground equipment. Now, 7 years later, there was still no school in sight, and these trailers started to get broken down. They were overcrowded, they were cold, they were moldy, and they were mice infested. Children as young as grade 4 started dropping out of school because of these terrible conditions. This was the only school that Shannon had ever known. She entered school in kindergarten in these trailers, and she was still in these trailers in grade 8. Now, Shannon didn't start out to be an upstander. She just wanted to go to a real school. But she started to become an upstander when she was 13 years old. She started campaigning for a new school. Now, this is a video that Shannon created for a grade 8 class project, and she used it in her campaign. Now, Shannon knew how hard it could be to learn when you lived in a First Nations community, because schools in First Nations communities are subject to the rules of the Indian Act, and they also receive far less funding than schools that are in non-First Nations communities. So Shannon led her fellow students in the Attawapiskat school campaign. Together, they used social media platforms like YouTube and Facebook to ask students across the country to write letters to the federal government to demand a new school for Attawapiskat and equal rights to education for all children. And the children answered their call. They wrote thousands and thousands of letters to the federal government. And 3 consecutive Minister of Aboriginal and Northern Affairs, the ministers, that was their title at the time, promised the children would have a new school in Attawapiskat. And those 3 ministers, one after another, broke their promise. And then finally in 2008, the federal government wrote a letter to Attawapiskat and said, "We're not going to be building you a new school. We don't have enough money." Well, when Shannon and her classmates heard that, they used the money that they had saved for their grade 8 class trip at the end of the year to travel to Ottawa to see if they could meet with the Minister of Aboriginal and Northern Affairs, Minister Chuck Strahl. And they did get a chance to meet him, and they did make their case. And still he said no. The government doesn't have enough money to give you a new school. Well, after that meeting, Shannon went out to the steps of Parliament and she made a speech to media. And she vowed never to quit until every child had what she called a safe and comfy school and access to a good education. And Shannon kept her promise. She went on to lead the largest youth-led children's rights campaign in Canadian history. It's called Students Helping Students. Shannon spoke from the heart to thousands of people, asking them for their help to get a new school and good education for all First Nations communities. She raised awareness across Canada and internationally about the conditions and the challenges that First Nations communities faced with education. And then finally, in 2009, the federal government said, "Yes, we will build you a school," because of the pressure that the students put on the government. And in 2014, a new school opened for Attawapiskat. But tragically, Shannon passed away in a car accident in 2010, so she never saw the new school open. The Shannon's Dream campaign was started in Shannon's memory and continues Shannon's work today to ensure that every child has access to a safe school and a comfy school and a good education. Now, Shannon has a lot to teach us about being an upstander. We're going to have a chat now to discuss how she was an upstander and what made her an upstander. Who can tell me what injustice Shannon recognized? Table 2. What injustice did Shannon recognize? Table 5.
She wanted a proper school because she did not have one, and everyone deserves proper education. The government had told her that the portables were just temporary till they got a new school, but that did not happen. There were no amenities, no gym, no playground, and nothing.
That's right. It was a pretty tough learning environment that they were trying to work in. There was inequalities in education. Now, what personal strengths did Shannon use to create change?
She posted online her belief to make evidence, used social media, committed, passionate, public speaking, empathic.
Yeah, she had lots of personal strengths. She was passionate, she was empathetic, she had good social media skills. Great. And finally, what actions did Shannon and her fellow students take to create change? Because they created change, they got that school.
The children and Shannon launched a campaign and wrote letters to the government, which spread across Canada.
That's right. They did a letter writing campaign. And we've got some virtual responses.
Yeah, there's a lot of awesome virtual responses. They spoke about the injustice that Shannon recognized, saying that the injustice Shannon stood up for was health and safety and the right of education for all children.
Great. Thank you, online audience. So we know that being an upstander is recognizing injustice. But how do we recognize injustice? Well, injustice is something that we can learn to recognize by doing 3 things. First, we can check with our gut and pay attention to how we're feeling. Next, we can compare what is happening for people with what should be happening for people in a situation. And finally, when we know an injustice is occurring, we need to build our knowledge about that injustice. Let's take a closer look at what this means. So often, when we see someone that's being treated unfairly, either by another person or by the government or by society more widely, we often feel that something's not right before we know what's wrong with the situation. And it's important for us to pay attention to these feelings. Think back to Shannon's story. How did you feel when I told you that kids were going to school in mice-infested, moldy, cold trailers, and that kids as young as grade 4 were dropping out of school? Not good. I think when we talked about this before, somebody used the word disgusted. It's important that we pay attention to those feelings, because when we have those feelings, when we see someone being mistreated, that's our first clue often to that an injustice is happening. So once we think an injustice is happening, the next thing we need to do is we compare what is happening for people with what should be happening for people. Again, if we think back to Shannon's story, what was happening or is happening was that there was no school in the community. There were unhealthy trailers. The children didn't have a library or a gym to go to, and kids were dropping out of school. And what should have been happening is that all children should have had access to a healthy and safe learning environment and a good quality education. So then how do we know what should be happening? Well, there's tools that we can use. Tools like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. Now, these tools tell us the standard rights and freedoms that everyone should have, and they also say what government and society should be doing to make sure that these rights and freedoms are protected. Now, UNDRIP, Article 14, the right to education, for example, tells us that Indigenous peoples have the right to set up and manage their own schools and education system, that Indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the same right as everyone else to go to school, and they cannot be left out because they're Indigenous. And it also tells us that governments have to guarantee that Indigenous peoples, whether they live in their community or outside of their community, have access to the same benefits of schools that other people have. Now, Shannon and her community knew that these things were not happening in their community. There was a difference between what was happening and what should be happening. An injustice was occurring. So once we know that an injustice is occurring, then we need to build our knowledge about the human rights injustice. We need to investigate. We need to find out who is being affected by the injustice. Where is the injustice happening? Why is it happening? What are the root causes that are enabling the injustice to continue? Because our goal as upstanders is to create change that will make a positive impact for the people who are affected by the change. And if we don't fully understand the problem, then the actions we choose to take might not actually have an impact. Let me show you what I mean. Who here remembers why the original school in Attawapiskat was closed?
The teachers and students started to get sick because of a diesel fuel leak that contaminated the area.
That's right, the land was contaminated and people were getting sick. Now, did you know that today, 29 First Nations communities in Canada have long-term drinking water advisories? This means that the drinking water in people's homes is unsafe to drink. And it's often unsafe to drink because dangerous materials like fuel get into the water supply and contaminate the water. Now, some of these communities need to boil water before they can drink it. In other communities, the water is so contaminated that it can't be drank at all, and you can't even take a shower in the water because it's too toxic. Now, more than half of these 29 communities have been under these long-term drinking water advisories for more than 10 years. And Attawapiskat was under an advisory for decades. So is it an injustice that these communities, there's First Nations communities in Canada that do not have easy access to safe and reliable drinking water in their homes when most of Canada has great drinking water that comes out of their tap anytime they want it? Hands up for if yes, this is an injustice. Yes, this is an injustice. Now, do we have enough information right now to go out and take action about this injustice? Not yet. We don't know who these 29 communities are. We don't know why their water is contaminated or is unsafe. And we don't know what's been happening in Canada that has allowed a drinking water crisis in First Nations communities to be happening for so long. So we have to remember that seeing an injustice is not enough as upstanders. We need to understand what the problem is. We need to build our knowledge to make sure that we're taking well-informed decisions so we can have a positive impact for the people who are affected by the injustice. Okay, so I've been talking lots, and now it's your turn. You have a chance in your groups for the next 2 minutes to talk about the injustices that you see in your community. You might want to talk about, how these injustices make you feel. If you're affected by them, who it's affected, why are they happening? Okay, so you've got 2 minutes. Talk amongst yourself about the injustices that you see in your communities.
One minute remaining. Okay, time is up. We're going to continue with our presentation, but don't forget you can continue to use your Upstander Inspiration Journal.
Okay, great. So based on the amount of discussion and writing I could see happening at each one of these tables, I think it's clear that injustice exists in each of our communities. So we know that upstanders recognize injustice, but upstanders also create change. Shannon's story helped us to understand what an upstander is and how to recognize injustice, but we're going to look at some more upstanders to explore how upstanders create change. Before we do this, can anybody tell me or share with me an example of an upstander that they know about? Somebody in their community, somebody that you've learned about?
Michael Linklater.
Michael Linklater? And who's Michael Linklater?
He is a professional 3v3 basketball player. He was getting bullied for braided hair. So and then he didn't really give a damn. When his son started getting bullied, he started a campaign called Boys with Braids.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. It's Michael Linklater. Anybody else have an example of an upstander that they'd like to share?
Dr. Nadine Karen. She was the first Indigenous female to graduate from the University of BC, and she is currently developing strategies to understand, prevent, and address issues among Indigenous peoples of Canada.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a professional sports star and we've got a doctor. Awesome. Thank you. Any contributions from online?
Not right now, but we're having some questions that'll come up soon, so stay tuned.
Okay, great. So every year, Imagine a Canada invites students from across Canada to imagine a reconciled Canada through art, essays, and community projects. And today we're going to look at one of those projects. We're going to look at a project that a group of grade 6 and 7 students from Burnaby, British Columbia did. The school was Westridge Elementary. Now, each of you has a profile of Westridge Elementary on the back of your Upstander journals. And if you don't have it, sorry, I'll advance it. If you don't have it, that's okay. We're going to post the profile online so you can read it from the PowerPoint in just a minute. But this is a group activity. So each class is a group. Your task is to read the profile and then answer these 3 questions and report back to the large group with your answers. What injustice did the students recognize? What personal strengths did they use to create change? And what change did these students create? So you have 5 minutes starting now. And if you don't have the profile, you can read it from here.
There are 2 minutes left in discussions. There's just about 1 minute left. Don't forget to write your answers in the chat if you are with us virtually today. Okay, time is up. We'd love to hear your responses.
All right. Well, let's hear what you guys discovered. So, who can give me an example of an injustice that the West Ridge Elementary students, I think we're at table one, that the West Ridge Elementary students recognized?
They were taking a stand against the harm that was done to the Indigenous children who were in residential schools.
Yeah, thank you. And they also were wanting to find a way to apologize for the racism that Indigenous people, past and present, have experienced in Canada. Okay, who can give me some personal examples of personal strengths that these students used to make their change? Oh, virtual?
Yeah, there's a lot of awesome responses. They use bravery, creativity, gratitude, a love of learning, teamwork, and they had courage as well.
Excellent. Do we have some more from our online group? Or I'm sorry, from our on-site?
The students of Westridge Elementary School utilized their creativity and teamwork skills to work alongside local artists and made elaborate presentations about their project.
Yeah, so they had lots of strengths. They took lots of different actions. Now, what change did the students at Westridge Elementary actually make? Do you remember it had to do with the crosswalk and they were creating a monument?
Yeah. Transform a crosswalk near the school into a residential school monument to honor survivors and all the children who were lost to their families and communities.
That's right. They were inspired by Call to Action 67, which was to create public monuments that would honor residential school survivors and remember the history of residential schools. These students also wanted to create a moment of reflection for the people in their community. For those people that were using the crosswalk every day, the students wanted them to take a moment so everyone in the community could think about how they would contribute to reconciliation. Let's see if I can advance this way. Sorry, we're having minor technical difficulty here. Okay, there we go. So we've seen that upstanders use lots of personal strengths, and we've seen some examples of personal strengths already. So part of being an upstander, though, is knowing your own personal strengths. Sometimes recognizing our own strengths can be difficult. Sometimes it's easier to recognize the strengths in those around us, in our classmates, in our communities, in our families. And that's what we're going to do today. To help us build our skills for recognizing our own strengths, we're going to look at strengths that are in those around us. So who can give me an example of some personal strengths, some gifts, abilities, talents that you see amongst your classmates, your community, your family?
Some examples would be public speaking, dedication, sports, compassion, and kindness.
Okay, great. That's a great list. Any online yet? Not yet?
We don't see any online yet, but there were some other awesome strengths that were shared, which were resilience. Here they are: empathy, their voice, leadership, kindness, and bravery.
Okay, excellent. So we've got a good list of strengths, examples of strengths. And when you think about strengths, some of the strengths that we've talked about are strengths that are visible, strengths that are easy to see. It's easy to see when somebody is a good public speaker because they're giving a speech. It's easy to see when they're a good athlete because they're winning games. It's easy to see if they're a good artist because we can see people's art. But sometimes strengths are invisible. Can anybody give me an example of an invisible strength that we've talked about today or that you've heard in our list?
So the students of that made the mural
Mhm.
has shown great empathy, communication, collaboration, and kindness.
Those are all excellent invisible strengths. They're not readily apparent, but they still are strengths. Now, can anybody tell me, hands up, if you have to be the best at something for it to be considered a strength? Do you have to be the best to have that at something? Hands up if you think yes. Hands up if you think no. No, you don't have to be the best at everything. Upstanders know the strengths that they have, but they also recognize the strengths that they want to develop. Upstanders know that they can build skills. Okay, so now we've talked a bit about strengths in other people. Now I'd like to give you some time to think about the strengths that you have. Don't worry, you don't have to share these with the group. Just take a minute. We've heard about lots of different kinds of strengths, visible and invisible, and write down on your Upstander journal what personal strengths you think you have that you could use as an Upstander. Okay, just take a moment to do that.
Thirty more seconds. Okay, time is up, but you can also continue to use your inspiration journal throughout the rest of today.
Okay, excellent. So we don't have to share your strengths, but I would like you to keep your journals. And as you think of more strengths or as other people share strengths that they see in you, write it down. It's important that we understand what our own strengths are. So 3 important strengths. Just get this, other than knowing how to use a computer, for upstanders are making sure that you understand or recognize the kind of strengths that are needed to create the change that you need to make. The next strength that every Upstander should have is the ability to recognize strengths in others. And third, every Upstander needs the ability to bring people together to build change, because Upstanders don't do it alone. And we've got one more Upstander story to share with you today to show you what we mean. This is Carrie Newman. Carrie is an Indigenous artist, master carver, filmmaker, and author. And Carrie's father was a survivor of residential school, and Carrie and his sisters are intergenerational survivors. And when Carrie learned that his father attended residential school, he set out to learn as much about the history of residential schools and this part of Canadian history as he could. He followed the work of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission very closely. And when he found out that the TRC was looking for commemoration projects, Carrie knew that he wanted to use his art to help tell the story of residential schools and the truth of this part of Canada's history. So Carrie had brainstormed many ideas. He knew he wanted to do something, but he wasn't quite sure what. And then one day, the idea came to him. He would create a wooden blanket that would hold an object from every residential school across Canada. Now, he knew this would be a big job because there were so many schools in every province and every territory. But he set to work by starting to make a plan. He brainstormed a list of questions that he needed to get started, like how would he find and collect all of these objects? How would he even make a wooden blanket? And who did he need on his team to create this wooden blanket? So once he got started and got his plan together, he set out the task of building his team. And he invited all kinds of people to join him in this project. He invited researchers, carpenters, other artists, web designers, filmmakers, and educators to join his team. Now, it took many years to complete the witness blanket. But completing the witness blanket was really just the start of the change that Carrie and his team created. It wasn't the end of the change. Because every year, thousands of people learn about the history of residential schools, the truth and reconciliation through the witness blanket, by coming to see the witness blanket here at the Museum of Human Rights, by going online to see the digital witness blanket at witnessblanket.ca, and by watching the film and books about how and why the witness blanket was created. So through the witness blanket, the stories of residential school survivors and the intergenerational survivors live on. So we've covered a lot today. We have learned what an Upstander is. We've learned about some Upstanders who are making change in their communities. And we've also learned about some injustices that are happening. And we've learned that injustice is happening in all of our communities. And we've learned about all kinds of different personal strengths that Upstanders are using to make change in their own way in their communities. But most importantly, we've learned that we are Upstanders. We're Upstanders for participating today. We know how to recognize injustice. We have personal strengths. And now it's up to us to make change in our communities in the way that we can using these strengths. So we hope that you will be inspired by this session. And in 2025, we hope that you'll take the Upstander Pledge and get involved through the Canadian Museum Human Rights Upstander Showcase and also through Imagine a Canada. So thank you guys for joining us today. We hope you have a great week.